Come out of the bathroom.
It's a new IBM Selectric.
Put your hands on your head.
Here,
Hands
of India.
on your head.
You're late. My name's Alan, Barry Allen, Secret Service. You think the FBI is on this guy?
We see some credentials.
Take my whole wallet. You want my gun, too? Hey, look out the window. My partner's walking in. Look. He jumped right through the window on. Hey, Murph. Yeah, PD again. I don't want people walking through my crimes.
I didn't expect the Secret Service on this.
Well, what's your name?
Hanratty.
What if I see some identification? Never can be too careful these days. Well, tough luck, Carl. Sit tight for a second while I get downstairs. You know, I don't want some...
Wait. Your wallet.
You hang on to it for a minute. I trust you.
Secret Service.
A young man named Frank Abagnale lives a prosperous and stable life in New Rochelle, New Jersey, with his parents, Frank Sr. and his French mother, Paula. One evening, the New Rochelle Rotary Club presents Frank Sr. with a token of achievement. Frank Jr. looks at his father with pride and admiration from the front row. Back home, Frank Sr. recounts how he met his wife, Paula. Meanwhile, Frank Jr. and his mother are dancing. His mother accidentally spills wine on the carpet, so Frank Jr. goes to the kitchen to get a towel. When he returns to the living room, he watches his parents lovingly dance to Ella Fitzgerald's Embraceable You. Early the next morning, Frank Sr. wakes his son abruptly and tells him not to go to school, but to come with him to an important meeting instead. The two drive to a tailor to borrow a black suit, but the woman refuses, saying they don't open for another half hour and that they don't lend out suits. In response, Frank Sr. produces a gold necklace from his pocket and asks the woman if it belongs to her. Moments later, Frank Sr. and his son drive to Chase Manhattan Bank, with Frank Jr. now wearing the black suit. Frank Sr. tells him to wait in the car and asks him if he knows why the Yankees always win. He then answers that it's because people can't take their eyes off the pinstripes, teaching Frank Jr. the value of deviousness and misdirection. Frank Sr. then enters the bank to borrow some money, but the teller refuses because he is under investigation for tax fraud. In the end, Frank Sr. fails to secure the loan and instead trades in their car. Later, the Abagnale family is forced to move out of their home because of their continued financial decline and Frank Sr.'s tax fraud issues. Despite this, Frank Sr. continues to do his best for his son. On Frank Jr.'s 16th birthday, Frank Sr. gives him a checkbook and opens a bank account for him with $25 still inside it, despite being knee-deep in their financial troubles. On his first day at public school, Frank Jr. is forced to wear his private school uniform because he doesn't know what else to wear and has gotten used to wearing it. When he enters the school, the local bully greets him with a shove. Frank Jr. makes his way to his classroom, and one of the students remarks that he looks like a substitute teacher. This gives him the impromptu idea to pose as one, so he starts ordering the students to sit down, and they comply. He then proceeds to teach the class, using the opportunity to humiliate the bully who shoved him earlier, leaving the boy flustered and convinced that he had picked on an actual teacher. A few weeks pass, and Frank Jr.'s parents are called in by the principal. He reports that Frank Jr. has been posing as a substitute teacher for weeks and has even held a parent-teacher conference. His parents are surprised by this, but Frank Sr. secretly takes pride in his son's shenanigans. Back at home, Frank Jr. is shocked to find his father's friend Jack leaving the bedroom with his mother. Frank Jr. is completely taken aback, and his mother, despite her discomfort, tries to keep him quiet with money. He then goes to his room and shuts the door. Some time passes, and Frank Jr. comes home to find yet another man in their house. Jr. lashes out in outrage, but the man calms him down and takes him to the room where his parents are waiting for him. The man is an attorney, and he explains that Frank Jr.'s parents are getting a divorce. They hand him an official document asking him to write down the name of the parent he wants to live with. Filled with emotion, the perplexed boy is unable to make a decision. Instead, he bolts out of the room and runs straight to the train terminal in a panic. For the next few months, Frank bounces back and forth between hotels and other odd places, trying to get back on his feet using the checkbook his father gave him. The checks are all fraudulent, however, since he doesn't have any money whatsoever. One day, Frank, who is still a minor, tries to pass himself off as an older professional to get a loan. He learns how to tamper with documents and checks to get his way, but he is rejected by every bank he visits since he is still learning. As Frank leaves another bank after failing to get a loan, a dignified pilot, together with several young and beautiful flight attendants, steps out of a cab. Frank is completely entranced by the impressive display and the admiration surrounding the pilot. Inspired, Frank gets the idea to pose as a pilot himself. He pretends to be a high school student writing an article for the school newspaper and interviews a professional at the airport. Through this, he gathers all the information he needs to impersonate a pilot. He then makes several phone calls to get in touch with one of Pan Am's uniform suppliers. Through his connivance, he receives an official uniform and even creates fraudulent payroll checks that Pan Am employees can cash. However, his constant lying eventually comes back to haunt him when he is boarded onto a plane as a deadhead, not knowing what the term means.
Are you my deadhead to Miami?
Yes.
Are you my deadhead? Frank? Captain Oliver?
Go ahead and take a seat, Frank. We're about to push.
Would you like a drink after takeoff?
Milk?
Check.
Positive range.
Gear up.
Over time, he's able to accumulate millions of dollars worth of forged checks using his slick charm and clever trickery. One afternoon, Frank meets with his father to surprise him with a Cadillac. While Frank Sr. is grateful, he refuses to use it because the IRS will think it's suspicious. He then becomes tearful as Frank Jr. brings up his mother. Still, Frank Sr. promises to continue fighting for her and to bring their family back together, which is what Frank Jr. wants more than anything else. Carl Hanratty, a no-nonsense and determined FBI agent, begins tracking down Frank because of his check fraud. Carl manages to arrive at the hotel where Frank is currently staying. He springs into action and heads for Frank's room. Frank is on his way to his hotel room when he passes Mr. Murphy, a blind old man being aided by his companion as they make their way out of the hallway. Frank greets Mr. Murphy and enters his hotel room. Moments later, Carl arrives, holding out a gun. He searches the room for Frank, who then appears from the bathroom despite Carl's intrusion. Frank looks at Carl with a poised and calm demeanor before telling him that he is Agent Barry Allen from the Secret Service. This lowers Carl's guard. Carl still demands identification. Just before Carl can open Frank's wallet, Frank directs him to the window, saying that his partner is already apprehending the criminal. Carl looks outside and sees Mr. Murphy being assisted to his car by his companion. This convinces him, and he lowers his guard. Frank then makes his exit while Carl is still holding his wallet. The man slumps down on the bed and checks the wallet, only to find it devoid of any identification cards. When he looks out the window, Frank is already running. Frank escapes and continues learning more about aviation by posing as a student writing a paper. Eventually, the airline professional stops him and tells him to leave, but not before handing him a newspaper article about a con artist posing as a pilot for various airlines called the Skyway Man. In the article, he is called the James Bond of the Sky. The remark inspires Frank to watch the latest James Bond film, after which he buys the exact suit and car that James Bond wore in the movie. He goes to a hotel and meets a seductive woman with whom he ends up spending Christmas Eve. Meanwhile, Carl Hanratty sits alone at his desk in the office while everyone else is with their families. Carl suddenly receives a phone call and hears Frank's voice. Frank apologizes for fooling him earlier and tells Carl that he wants to meet him at a hotel. But Carl calls it a bluff and dismisses the whole thing. He then upsets Frank by pointing out that the only reason he's calling is because he has no one else to call. Frank then hangs up, and Carl is left getting a kick out of it. The following day, Carl spends his morning in a diner. He also looks up Barry Allen in the phone book and finds several people listed under that name. A young waiter happens to see his papers and asks him if he's a fan of Barry Allen. With Barry Allen being the true identity of the fictional superhero, The Flash, Carl suddenly realizes that Frank is just a kid. With this new information in mind, he calls his partners and tells them to look into every missing child case to try and find Frank. Eventually, Carl and the FBI agents find Frank's mother, Paula. Paula, who is now remarried, cooperates with the FBI agents. She hands them a picture of her son from his yearbook, allowing Carl to identify Frank and learn his name. Meanwhile, Frank is living it up, using his money to throw parties. At one such party, a friend of his gets into an accident and has to be taken to the hospital. There, Frank meets a young nurse named Brenda Strong. The two of them quickly build a connection and are immediately enamored with each other. Frank tells Brenda that he is a doctor looking for a job. It's unclear at first why he decides to impersonate a doctor, but later, in a letter to his father, he states that he's tired of running and wants to find someone to settle down with, hinting at his affection for Brenda. Frank manages to con his way into becoming a doctor named Frank Connors, even securing a supervisory position at the hospital. Frank and Brenda's affection blossoms into a romance. One day, the two share a kiss in Frank's office. However, the moment is interrupted when Frank is called to the ER. The staff asks for his advice on how to treat a young boy who has been injured in a bicycle accident. Despite his lack of any formal knowledge, Frank fakes his way out of the situation and gets away with it. Meanwhile, Carl Hanratty visits Frank Sr., and from their meeting, Carl immediately realizes where Frank Jr. inherited his sly personality. Frank Sr. is evasive with his answers whenever he's asked about his son. But before Carl leaves, Frank Sr. tells him that he'll never give up his son. This is when Carl spots Frank Jr.'s letters spread out on the table, and he takes note of the address. After some time, Frank expresses his genuine feelings for Brenda and even asks her to marry him. They both agree to meet Brenda's parents over lunch. While they're there, Frank mentions that he's also a lawyer, just like Brenda's father. This is news to Brenda, and she excitedly tells her father to let Frank work for him at his law office. Later on, Brenda's father confronts Frank about who he really is. To this, Frank says, "I'm not a doctor. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an airline pilot. I'm nothing really. I'm just a kid who's in love with your daughter." Luckily for him, Brenda's father misinterprets it as a metaphor and gives Frank his blessing. Frank eventually passes the Louisiana bar exam and begins working with Brenda's father. There, he tries to learn what he can about the law, but gets yelled at by a judge after mishandling some legal procedures. Frank begins to feel dejected as he watches Brenda and her family happily spending time together because it reminds him of his own family, which is now broken. Frank then meets with his father at a bar and eagerly tells him that they'll get their family back together. Frank Sr., who is now working at the post office, tells his son that his mother, Paula, has already remarried, upsetting Frank Jr. He tells his father that he wants to stop running, but his father encourages him to keep going. Frank Jr. leaves. It's Christmas Eve, and once again, Frank gives Carl a call. He tells him that he wants a truce and that he's getting married soon. Carl then says that he doesn't have a choice and that he needs to catch him because it's his job. Frank tells him that he just thought he should ask, then wishes him a Merry Christmas before hanging up. Carl has a new lead when he realizes that Frank won't be changing his last name this time since he's getting married. It isn't long before Carl finds his way to Frank and Brenda's wedding party. When Frank sees Carl arriving, he retreats to his room and Brenda follows after him. He finally tells her everything and then gives her instructions to meet him at the airport 2 days later. The couple bid each other a heartbreaking goodbye just as they are about to begin their life together. Carl steps into the room, but Frank is already gone. 2 days later, Frank is waiting for Brenda at the airport. He spots her wearing a pink top and carrying her luggage. He is elated to see her, but is quickly disappointed when he notices her seemingly taking instructions through a concealed earpiece. Frank surveys the surroundings and anticipates the FBI's presence, causing him to leave. Frank then hatches a plan to get through the airport once again. He poses as a pilot and comes up with a fake internship program, which he offers to 8 young women from a nearby school. Carl, who has about 100 men monitoring airport security, is waiting for Frank. But Frank simply walks through the terminal in his pilot uniform, accompanied by his entourage of beautiful flight attendants, distracting the all-male security team. Frank eludes them once again and flies straight out of the country. 7 months later, the FBI grows weary of chasing Frank, with the sole exception of Carl, who still has every intention of capturing him. Eventually, Carl realizes that the checks recovered from Frank are all genuine checks. This leads him to ask several experts what kind of machine could produce that type of check. The experts mention that those machines also exist in other countries. Carl then remembers his conversation with Paula and figures that Frank might be in his mother's hometown in France. Carl finally tracks down Frank in Montrechard. It's Christmas Eve, and a crowd of people gathers at the nearby chapel. Carl enters the check factory and finds Frank producing checks by the hundreds. A frightened and exhausted Frank welcomes Carl like an old friend. At this point, Carl seems almost concerned and protective, so he tries to convince Frank to give up. He tells him that, because of the embarrassment Frank has caused them, the French police are now planning to kill him. Frank finally lets Carl take him, but when they go outside, he is taken into custody by the French police and sent to a local prison. There, he nearly dies because of the poor prison conditions. Eventually, Carl finds a way to bring Frank back to the United States. While they are on the plane, Carl informs Frank that his father has died. Grief-stricken, Frank escapes from the plane through the bathroom stall. He hurriedly goes to the home where his mother and her new husband live. Despite all of his staggering efforts, Frank only ends up having the last bit of hope sucked out of him. He sees that his mother has moved on with her life and now has a young daughter, leaving him without both his father and any chance of bringing his family back together. Frank loses the will to go on. Finally, he surrenders to Carl, who has arrived with the FBI. Frank is then sentenced to 12 years in a maximum security prison. During his sentence, Carl visits Frank every now and then. On one such visit, he shows Frank a fraudulent check that he's working on. Frank instantly identifies that the bank teller is involved in the scheme. Impressed, Carl convinces the FBI to let Frank serve the remainder of his sentence working for the FBI in the bank fraud unit. Frank agrees and begins working with Carl, much to the hesitation of the other FBI agents. One day, while walking down the street, Frank notices a tailor shop with a pilot uniform on display, reminding him of his former exploits. With the weekend approaching, sorrow begins to creep in as Frank realizes he has no friends or family to support him. This causes him to slip back into his old habits, and that weekend he puts on a pilot uniform and attempts to board a plane. Before he can, Carl intercepts him and tells him that no one is chasing him anymore. If Frank wants to leave, Carl won't stop him because he knows he'll be back. Monday comes, and Carl nervously waits to see what decision Frank has made. To his relief, Frank returns and helps Carl with the case. Finally, Frank has found a place where he belongs. The film is based on a true story. Frank eventually turned his extraordinary talents toward fighting fraud instead of committing it. He built a successful career as one of the world's leading experts on bank fraud and forgery. He married, raised 3 sons, and even remained friends with the FBI agent who spent years chasing him, Carl Hanratty. If you enjoyed this recap, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next movie recap. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.